Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos al webinar de Beatles in India que organiza la Casa de la India en Valladolid en el marco de la exposición que se titula Indian Odyssey, The Beatles in India, el universo de Ravi Shankar, que acoge el Centro Cultural Fernán Gómez de Madrid hasta el día 17 de enero, una exposición que fue coproducida por la Casa de la India y el Fernán Gómez, Centro Cultural de la Villa, Madrid Destino, para conmemorar el centenario de Ravi Shankar. Es hoy un día muy privilegiado para nosotros porque vamos a poder presentarles a una figura que es especialista en los temas de Beatles relacionados con la India, Ajoy Bose, que ha podido ser testigo de aquellos años, de las experiencias de la visita del Beatles a la India, que ha editado un libro fantástico sobre el tema hace unos años, que ha editado Penguin, y que acaba de terminar un documental que se titula precisamente The Beatles in India, que será presentado en breve, esperemos a lo largo de este año también en España. A warm welcome to the webinar, The Beatles in India, which is presented to you by Casa de la India in the framework of the exhibition that is titled Indian Odyssey, The Beatles in India, the Ravi Shankar Universe. In particular, we have a section on Ravi Shankar because we're celebrating the centenary of the Guruji, Ravi Shankar, the great sitar maestro, and the second section also on the topic of the Beatles in India, which we are analyzing today with a very prestigious expert, Ajoy Bose, journalist from New Delhi, live brought to you by Casa de India, right from New Delhi. A warm welcome, Ajoy Bose. How are you? And namaskaram.
Namaskar, namaskar. I'm very happy to be with you, Guillermo. And it is a wonderful occasion, really, to be here, even if we are virtually together. I was hoping that we'd be together physically, but this is good.
Yes. Let me briefly introduce you to the audiences before we move on to the topic. And since we are having both Spanish and audiences from India, from around the world, this webinar will be held in English, and therefore, if audiences don't mind, I will introduce you in English. Perhaps in a few years, Ajoy, we can have this conversation in Spanish as well.
Of course, Spanish.
In the meantime, thank you so much for accepting to do this session. I know it's been difficult the last few months and last few weeks, but we have overcome difficulties, you in particular, so wish you all the best there in India. And I think culture has to go on. We've been very, very lucky to be able to do this exhibition. It's been almost a miracle that it could take place as well. In fact, thanks to your advice and support as well, we got some wonderful material. So we're very grateful for that. And of course, also to the Ravi Shankar Foundation, who helped us for the section on Ravi Shankar, and so many others, Silver Screen from London, and a host of people, Patty Boyd, so many people also you put us in touch with. So it's almost a miracle. And let's have a discussion on the topic of the Beatles in India. Such a fascinating idea of bringing West and East and West together at that particular moment of 1968. Before we do that, let me briefly introduce you to Ajoy. Ajoy Bose is a veteran print journalist, a television commentator and author. He was the India correspondent of The Guardian in London for over 2 decades and the executive editor of the Pioneer newspaper in New Delhi. He has been a commentator on various leading Indian television channels and was till recently the resident commentator of CNN News 18. So we have really a historical figure in terms of journalism, Indian journalism, and that could be another session for another time. You describing those years and the experiences you had with heads of state and so on. I've been privy to some of those stories. That will be another session in the future, I suppose. His books include a widely acclaimed book on the emergency for reasons of state, Behenji, a multi-edition political biography of Mayawati, the leader of Bengali leader of India's lowest caste Dalits, and his latest book, Across the Universe, recreating the fascinating journey of the Beatles to India in 1968, which is half a century ago. Pretty much there was 50 years celebrations a couple of years ago. And yes, he has just finished directing his first film as well, documentary film on the same subject, the Beatles in India, which has been inspired by this book. The book is on display here. We don't have a translation yet into Spanish, but we're hoping to get it out sometime soon. Perhaps if any editor and publisher is listening, will be encouraged to do so. Again, Ajoy, I think it's one of those privileged moments in the history of, I think, the topic of the discussion we have today. It's one of those moments, I always say, it's like if the history of India and the West, if you look at some of the highlights, for some reason, in terms of popularity, in terms of the scale and the impact, global impact, there have been very rare moments because of also the year we were talking about with television all over and of course media very active. It's not the same if colonial travelers went in the 19th century, there was no media. Now the new experience of all those Westerners flocking in the 1960s reached its peak, or at least was at its peak with the Beatles in India. So you've written this wonderful book. Let's come straight to the topic and the questions, if you don't mind. How did you get interested in this subject? Was it your curiosity as a journalist, as an analyst of the recent history of India, or was it the Beatles fan in you?
Honestly, Guillermo, I never ever thought that I would write a book on the Beatles. I love the Beatles. I'm deeply interested in rock music. But I'm basically a political commentator. I've always been a political commentator. And my publisher is Penguin Random House, and they published a number of books of mine, all political. So when Penguin Random House approached me and said, Ajoy, can you do a book on the Beatles? I fell from the sky. I said, how fabulous. How fabulous. I mean, I get a lot of book offers. Most of them I reject because the book takes a lot out of you. But this was so flattering to me. Of course, the chief editor of Penguin Random House is the daughter of a very good friend of mine. And she knew I was a Beatles fan. And she wanted a book by a Beatles fan, but not a music writer. And there the adventure starts. My adventure with the Beatles starts. I mean, this book has been something almost like the Beatles' adventure to India, because I rediscovered the Beatles, who were, I'm from the Beatles generation. I grew up in the 60s. My fights with my father was about the Beatles. How long my hair should be.
Yes.
I mean, you'd be amazed that the Beatles was larger than life. And that's when the Beatles came to India, wearing psychedelic flowers on my shirt. So my rebellion against establishment, came through the Beatles. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I can't tell you, of rediscovering the Beatles, researching the Beatles, getting to know more about the Beatles, and telling the story. Because the Beatles are more than the music. It is a saga, and it's a fairy tale that will never go stale. It is something which is very difficult to explain in rational terms. Because tell me, 60 years later, the Beatles are bigger than what they were earlier. I mean, the Beatles never imagined it would be so. I had some wonderful sessions with their first big biographer, Philip Norman, in London, at the Jaipur Literary Festival in Jaipur. And Phillips, who knew all of them, said, they really didn't believe that they would last more than 10, 15 years. So this is something very magical. And the book became this journey to discover the Beatles. And it just completely changed, to some extent, my perception of the Beatles. And I realized what a great band they were. And they go beyond their music, because it is the story. It is the story of the Beatles. Yeah. And India plays a very important part, because I think this bridge which they built between Western culture and Eastern culture, now we are, the world is a much smaller place. But when they did that in the 60s, it was a pioneering leap forward into another culture. And I think that is a tremendous thing which the Beatles did.
Yeah, let's come to the story then, because some people may not be familiar with this. But this is 1968. The Beatles are, at their peak, but at the same time, very close to dismantle the band, which people did not know at the time. Now, this trip can be narrated. Now, I'm looking at it from, literary critic point of view, or historian's point of view, as an initiation trip, a coming-of-age journey from innocence to experience, if you may, with its multiple connotations as far as Indian spirituality, mysticism, and the hippie movement is concerned. So, for those who may not be familiar with the story, could you compress it into like 5 minutes to give us, in a nutshell, as a tale, and if you can compress it 5-6 minutes, we give you a minute or so. Just give us the plot. What is the story? What's the book about?
I should try. Now, you mentioned 68. But actually, the Beatles and India saga starts 3 years earlier. In 65, the day when George Harrison, almost curiously and by accident, picks up the sitar on the set of Help. They're in an Indian restaurant, there are Indian musicians, and there is the sitar, the strange-looking instrument. And that's the first time George Harrison, a guitarist, looks at this strange instrument with so many strings. One of the chapters, when I described it, the sitar has many strings. That's what I call it. And George is very curious. And he picks up the sitar and then puts it down, but it's in his head. And I do believe, honestly, I do believe there is something mystic, there is something karmic about the Beatles' journey to India, because it is an amazing set of coincidences, almost as if by a divine hand. So there is George's first encounter with the sitar. Shortly afterwards, what happens is George and John, again by accident, take their first LSD trip with their dentist. The dentist mixes LSD in their cup. And then what happens is they have these hallucinations. And one of the hallucinations of George, he hears a whisper, yogis in the Himalayas. That's what he hears in his head. He doesn't realize the importance of that. And then we move on to their next LSD trip. And their next LSD trip, funnily enough, the Birds are there. They met Ravi Shankar before, and they mention Ravi Shankar, and they show some of the riffs which Ravi Shankar played. And George is fascinated. George goes back to London, and he buys a cheap sitar. He starts hearing a few albums of Ravi Shankar. Mind you, he still hasn't met Ravi Shankar, but he's fascinated by the sound which he hears. He's getting more and more interested in the sitar. And then the story starts unraveling. We look to 66. Sorry, before that, they are recording Norwegian Wood. And John wants a bit of zip in the Norwegian Wood song. So John suggests, hey, you bought that sitar. Why don't we try and use that sitar? And that's when sitar is used for the first time in rock music.
Yeah.
And the sitar string breaks. So what happens? They get in touch with the Asian music circle, which is the sort of big sort of Indian classical music place in London. And the Angadis, Ayana Angadi, who heads Asian Music Circle, he brings over a string and they become friendly with George. And George starts suddenly meeting Indian musicians, getting involved in India. He and Patty become very, very friendly with Ayana and his British wife, Patricia, their son, Shankar. And then George's relationship with India starts. So the India connection starts much earlier than 68. Now, George is getting more and more interested, and the Beatles at that time are looking to innovate their music. This is exactly the time when they're moving away from being a pop group into a serious rock group, and they're looking at innovations. And they find George's Indian content that he brings very useful. So this carries on, the relationship deepens. They start using music in their albums which are Indian. George himself gets more and more deep into Indian culture. So the India connection is being, yes, please.
Yes, the turning, can you come to the turning point where, this is a wonderful background. I think it's quite, people don't know that it was a gradual thing and it wasn't just a, but the gradual thing, the meeting them, and because they actually went in to meet and do meditation with him. If you can come to that episode.
Absolutely. So I'm just coming to that. So this is the lead up, and then in 67 and 68, 67, they meet Maharishi.
Yes.
And that too is just because Patty, George's wife, decides to join Transcendental Meditation, and they attend his first class. The Maharishi calls them to their special camp in Wales. Just that time, their own manager, mentor, friend, guide, Brian Epstein, dies while they're at Bangor. They turn to the Maharishi as their new mentor. And the Maharishi says, drop everything, come to India. Spend time in the camp. I will do a special camp for you. You come and join me in my ashram. And they, of course, take some time to get there, but they do get there. And that is a huge experience for them. For the first time, they're away from the studio, they're away from everything. They're in an Indian jungle. They're just next to an Indian jungle.
Rishikesh.
So absolutely mind-blowing experience for the Beatles. They start thinking like individuals. It doesn't end too well, though, because they have this fight with the Maharishi. We can talk about that later, because it's a very interesting sort of, my book sort of deals with everything. But what happens is that it changes them. And I do believe, I'm convinced, that it is that experience of thinking as individuals which ultimately led to their breakup, because the time was come for the Beatles to go. But what is amazing, and this is the great thing about the Beatles, no other rock band has ever done that. While they're breaking up, and there's a lot of ugly fighting going on, they produce their best work. Their best two albums, White Album, Abbey Road, is just fabulous. They are at their peak when they're breaking up.
Well,
so I mean that's the story. I mean that's the story which
that's the framework, and let's come to a bit of the characterization, the characters in the plot. Like in any good story, would you say there are the good guys and the bad guys? And in this tale, there are the devils and angels, the messengers, the muses. Because I like the way you play around and give each figure, each character a role, and that's also quite Indian. You don't have to read the Mahabharata or Ramayana to know that, but in any tale there are these archetypes, and there are those who get illuminated, for whom this was a really spiritual trip. Others get transformed, transfixed. Others become others, strangers, either by their own actions or by those of others. With shifting perceptions, I like to say, and as Maya, in a way, illusion plays its game, because it's like a game. It's almost like a game of dice, because there's a kind of rivalry that's going on. So, can you just delineate or describe who are the main characters? I mean, we have the Fab Four, of course. We know who they are. We know George. You mentioned George, but if you can tell us about John's attitude, a little bit about the other two, Paul and Ringo, who played a more peripheral role. But what are the archetypes also besides the Fab Four, and how did this episode eventually affect each one of them, not as a whole? If you can identify those aspects, please.
Let me separate this into two sections. One is there are two big relationships which I talk about in the book. One is the relationship between George Harrison and Ravi Shankar, which is a unique, extraordinary relationship, and which deepens and deepens and deepens and carries on well forward till George Harrison dies.
Not in the ashram, of course. George went in afterwards.
But no, not in the ashram.
He's not in the ashram. Ravi is not.
Not in the ashram. Yeah, Ravi. And the other is the relationship between the Beatles and the Maharishi, but most particularly the relationship between John Lennon and the Maharishi.
Yes.
And it's John who is really fascinated by the Maharishi, much more than anybody else. He's the one who's pushing it. He's the one who really, George is already hooked on India through Ravi Shankar. He considers almost himself an Indian. He eats Indian. He thinks Indian.
Yeah.
Everything which, if you went to his house that time, everything is Indian. It has got no resemblance to a British household. Whereas John, who is the person who's taking the maximum number of hard drugs and is not getting any satisfaction, because John was completely haunted by inner demons. He was a very troubled man. He's looking for an escape, and that is where Maharishi gives the mantra, the magic mantra, the transcendental meditation mantra. And I think that is something which is an amazing relationship between John and the Maharishi, which ends very badly. So, and that is the great thing about the story of the Beatles. It is a modern fairy tale, but it is also, it has many aspects, many paradoxes, because John's fierce love and worship for the Maharishi was also shaped by the fact that he was the closest to his manager, Brian Epstein.
Yeah.
When Brian died, John clung on to the Maharishi. And when the Maharishi, John felt, was like any other human being, he turned on the Maharishi, and John could be very vicious. So I think that is also there. But let me tell you about the ashram and the four Beatles and why they went to the ashram. Now, as far as George was concerned, he was always ready to go to India. In fact, India was, he considered it his home. He felt more comfortable in India than in Britain. And so he was very happy. He was happy to go to the ashram. For John, however, he was seeking this mantra. That was the Holy Grail. So he had a very definite purpose that I'm going to go there, find the mantra, and I will be free. I will be liberated. For Paul, who was a very practical man, and he was a man who really was thinking constantly about the band or what is for the next album, the new Apple industry which he started. So he was the businessman there. So he said it would be a good break. It will be a good vacation. The boys have played constantly, and it's a good break. So he saw it as a vacation to charge up your batteries and then get back to making more albums. And Ringo, of course, was always there. I mean, he was such a good sport. Although he left his 2 young children behind, he just dragged his wife, and poor chap, he had to go back to his children in 2 weeks. There were insects troubling his wife. Ringo had terrible food. He had a very weak stomach. He couldn't do the Indian food at all. But Ringo was always up there. He was always a good sport and ready to try everything. So these are 4 different people looking at different things in the ashram. But the fact of the matter is that this ashram really changed the Beatles fundamentally.
So why do you think that's so? And who else was there?
Well, that is the other story, because there are lots of other celebrities there. You have Mia Farrow, just about divorced from Frank Sinatra. And we're talking about big names here. We have big names. Mia Farrow, who decides with her sister, who's already into transcendental meditation, to come to the ashram. Also, I think, because she heard that the Beatles were going there, and it was a good publicity thing for her. But mind you, Mia Farrow was just getting into show business in a serious way. So the Beatles brand would be good for her. And of course, the Maharishi is infatuated by Mia Farrow. I describe in detail in the book about, Maharishi got completely distracted when Mia Farrow was there. Lovely scenes, with Mia Farrow and Maharishi. And of course, there's a famous scene where Mia Farrow was hugged from behind by Maharishi. Now, whether it had any other intent or it was just a guru's love for his disciple, we don't know. But the fact of the matter, it was there. And then you have Mike Love of the Beach Boys. You have Donovan. You have these great sort of musicians who are there. Paul Horn, the jazz flautist. So you have, these people as well, sort of, there. So, and they were all sort of together with the Beatles, practicing music. And it was, for the Beatles, a great learning curve, because Donovan taught them many new things, many new ways of playing the guitar.
Yes.
They were constantly discussing music. The whole day was there to practice music. And, to play not, and this is something which is very important to understand. The Beatles were like trained workhorses. Before they went to the ashram, they had a purpose. When they were practicing for an album. There was no time to, just be.
Yes.
They were always there in the studio. They had numbers. They had a purpose. Here, they were just playing. They're just playing, just for fun. And that is why the White Album, which contains all these songs, is so unique, so different, because it is sort of totally a mixed bag. So, it's quite amazing. They wrote 32 songs in that short period, when they were there.
Tell us some of the famous songs. Can you just mention a few of them?
Well, the ones used in the White Album, the Back in the USSR, Bye Bye Blackbird, Bungalow Bill, Dear Prudence, and these are all, sometimes incidents. Prudence Farrow, Dear Prudence was about Prudence Farrow being locked up inside and meditating, and John decided to get her out. So, so that was a song. Now, Bungalow Bill is it is such a typical John song. I mean, there was this guy who was the son of Maharishi's social secretary, Nancy Cook de Herrera. And can you imagine, he came for meditation, but went on a tiger hunt. And he shot a tiger.
My God.
And he came back. And then had the audacity to beg the Maharishi's forgiveness for doing that. So John wrote this acid song. I mean, only, John's absolute sarcastic best.
Very sarcastic.
I mean, wonderful song which goes by. And then, of course, a song like Julia, ode to John's mother, which is so fantastic. It's always a very interesting sort of combination and so different. Obladi Oblada, which is just a sort of typical Paul sort of composition. And, Paul describes a walking down an Indian village with the Maharishi leading them and singing Obladi Oblada, and through an Indian village. So, these are sort of lovely vignettes of that, almost paradise. Situation for the Beatles, where they were cut off from busy London studio life, and living in this idyllic world, and playing their music.
So this is perhaps the initial journey, or if this was a series of chapters itself, where it may sound, it does sound idyllic and kind of fun and recreative, and a break from their really intense life, because they were superstars and wherever they went, they had their crowds. But exactly what they had attempted to do, to run away from the crowds, in a way it bounced back. So I like that point in the book where you reach that point of gravity where suddenly everything comes back down onto them. And you have obviously people who start to find out about them being there, though they didn't want to disclose a lot of information. And the Maharishi, I think, did a fairly good job at blocking them from other people. But then you get journalists, people sneaking in, others calling others, and then it becomes a big hype, and the press finds out. I love that. And even was it the KGB or CIA, and then political term. I love the way you have given also the cultural context. And by the way, I should mention that I think the main credit for me and to the public is that they have chosen an Indian author to write this, not a Western, because the Indian perspective from a cultural point of view, and to bring in that angle, I think for me, this is one of the assets, plus points of the book, and the what enriches the book. In particular, the reaction, I've written down a few notes here, of the middle, of course, upper and middle class of Indians. And if I make it to you've mentioned that you were a Beatles fan yourself, and the youth, the rebellious youth. This is post-colonial India, 60s, where you had that generation of people that had not experienced Gandhi and so on, and Beatles mania and the globalization of music. So what was, in your view, the overall perception of the Indian middle class, the urban middle class, okay, I'm talking about the urban, towards the hippie movement, and how much that kind of lingers today? Does it still prevail, that idea, the notion of the hippies? Maybe it's two questions in one.
I get what you mean.
And then the reaction to those who followed, because a lot of people started talking to India after that. So
yes,
from that perspective, because this is not somebody writing who's a known Beatles expert as such. You're a journalist, more of a cultural historian, writing from within India. So I'd like to know more about that.
Absolutely. Well, let me just first precede everything by saying that one of the amazing things was that this was a bridge between the post-Second World War European, society, post-Second War Britain, which was changing fast to the 60s, with a post-colonial society in India, a new generation, and they were looking for something different. And there is a great paradox here because the Beatles were turning to India to ancient wisdom, even as their followers and their fans in India were looking at modernity. They were symbols of modernity, and they were. So there's a great paradox here, the great cultural paradox, and that is why this relationship is so fascinating. But and my prologue, and this I had to do very cleverly because the Beatles story, once it takes off, you can't pause. You can't pause because it goes from that sitar, George finding the sitar, and it goes on to its end, that I didn't want to pause that story. I did it in the prologue, the first chapter. I look at India and the Beatles, not Beatles and India, but India and the Beatles. And of course, the Beatles change everything in, people who love rock and roll and rock music, because once the Beatles came, then Elvis Presley, Cliff Richards, all the earlier crooners just went, to the side because there was a new Beatles generation, and I lived that. I really graduated from that, so I know what it was. Bands started going, becoming cover bands for the Beatles, and I go in great detail in the first Beatles cover bands, and I talk to many of them, including Bitu with, the Jets, and in a whole range of, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Calcutta, there were new bands who came up emulating the Beatles. The Beatles were the new thing. And then, of course, the Beatles story in India became even bigger when they came. And when they came, and that's a nice little diversion, it was a subject of parliamentary debate because at that point, the communists and the socialists were strong in parliament, and they felt that the British were foreign spies brought in by the Maharishi who had CIA connections. So it's a very interesting kind of reaction. And then there was Ravi Shankar and the Beatles. Ravi Shankar, people were very proud of Ravi Shankar because he was the cultural czar of India. And many people felt that the Beatles have stolen Ravi Shankar. So there are many aspects of the impact of the Beatles in India, and I think that Bollywood even, and in the film we do more Bollywood than this. But I do mention that here it is quite amazing how much Bollywood saw the Beatles as the symbol of the modern band. In this thing. So there is the Beatles' impact on Indian culture was very interesting about, with particularly the English-speaking middle class.
And yet you can take it, with humor. You can take it from the post-colonial, historian angle, or you can take it, if you want, from a literary aesthetic angle. I remember when I first traveled to India, I was reading this really hilarious book, which to me was like an eye-opener because it was written by an Indian who was familiar with both, the diaspora Indian and Indians living in India and the West. And this is Geeta Mehta's Karma Kola, Marketing the Mystic East, which was published in '79. And this was really a sarcastic portrait of those hordes of Westerners flocking to India, seeking salvation, as you mentioned, in the 1960s. Became a trendsetter, is now a classic. Your book is also written in an ironic mode. I mean, it's a kind of tragic comedy because, as you say, it doesn't really end that well. The group splits. They are estranged from the Maharishi, though they kind of pardon him later. I would not particularly say it's a tragedy, not at all, because it through growing up, and that's why I said it's a kind of story of coming of age, because they learn so much, I think, in this trip as persons. They're enriched, they're exposed to different environments, meet a lot of people, and creativity. I think everyone going to India to spend time, if you have that quality time in the nature and the Himalayas, if you're an artist, whether you're a painter, musician, particularly a genius like Beatles, you know, what you create wonderful songs. So that really did that. That's what it did to them. Could have happened somewhere else, but it had to be in India.
Yeah,
So
sure.
when you take this material, you know, as a writer, okay, that's why I'm referring to this other book. Were you sure about the tone you wanted to set, this right dose of irony and sarcasm? Because you can't overdo it either. I mean, you have to be respectful to the characters and so on. And though I could not but laugh at some points in the book. It's just too much. And also I think the way it's designed and this pop design, very beautiful edition, by the way. I think Penguin has done a great job. But you take it lightly in a way, and at a distance, and it's interesting. Did you have that in mind from the beginning? Or?
Well, you know, as it turns out, Burmo, that I met Geeta Mehta shortly after she wrote Karma Kola.
Oh.
We had some very good common friends, very good common friends. So I remember having dinner with his friends at house and meeting Geeta for the first time. And we discussed her book, and, you know, we sort of, you know, naturally, me being a journalist, and she wanted to know what was the feedback about the book, you know, her book. And so it was a very interesting book, of course. I mean, you know, it was a very well-written book. And later it became absolute sort of, you know, cult classic. Now, my approach was a little different. I mean, although I think that to some extent there are all these stereotypes and there are these big things of India being exotic and everything. But at the same time, I do recognize that the Beatles, although the hippies started earlier than the Beatles, with the Beatles, the hippies became a flood. You know, what was a trickle became a flood, because when the Beatles came to India, and the Beatles were so big in the West, I think it really made a lot of young people in the West come to India, discover India. And although, I mean, maybe you can just look at it in terms of just smoking a bit of hash, or, you know, you can look at it in purely, I think it was young people in the West opening their minds to a different culture. And I don't feel the need to be sarcastic about that at all. I think that's very good. And I think it did sort of change the lives of many people. And again, I mentioned post-colonial society because this was not the relationship of Indians before, earlier on. I mean, the British were rulers, the Westerners were rulers, they were the ruling class.
Yeah.
And suddenly everything changed. And they were coming to India for wisdom. You know, and I think that was a huge change in the West, in young people in the West. They were no longer viewing the world the way they were earlier. You know, the 60s was such an interesting decade because whether it's the music or the culture or the art, it had suddenly, you know, had become experimental and it had become global.
And yet, Ajoy, how much of that stereotype and the bias or the 19th century Orientalism, right? You have the writers, travel writers, you have Ian Foster, you have the German Orientalists, the French.
Sure.
And isn't that the 60s in a way, the rediscovery? And let's leave aside drugs for a moment, because that was another reason why, people were flocking not just to India, Afghanistan, Nepal, and other places. But isn't it a way of continuing, or wasn't it a way of continuing to exoticize, orientalize this, the mystic, exotic aura of India that was constructed in the colonial, modern, as well as postmodern? A different kind of, people say it's more of a cultural colonialism, but I'm saying the other way around, Orientalism. Isn't that in a way also, to what extent is it an advantage and a disadvantage? Because it helps tourism, it's a simplification, of course, but it's also a branding. And I have to say, to some extent, all countries, take Spain, for instance, take the Mediterranean, which has also been orientalized, take that to, in modern times, as an advantage to attract tourism, to brand. There's a danger, there's advantage and disadvantage. So I wanted to have your views on that and how you think that this give and take, where the right balance and where we are now. I mean, we talk about 1968, but let me just briefly, shift to 2021. Of course, after the 60s, we had the 90s, when you had a revival of what we call New Age. We have now, in the last few years, again, a revival of yoga. I mean, transcendental meditation, Maharishi Yoga is no more. There were so many other gurus, so many other things, but isn't it still a cliche of Westerners traveling to India to seek spiritual enlightenment, and then they might find a much more complex society. So I want to say it's a complex assessment.
But honestly,
and this could be again another session, but just some of the glimpses and your point of view.
well, honestly, I don't think it applies anymore. If you look at really what is happening, I mean, most of the Indian music a lot of it is being composed, or at least before COVID, was being composed in London studios. Music, the beat, the popular music, Indian popular music, Bollywood music, the many regional Bollywood music. There is so much cultural osmosis. Somebody like Rahman is a sort of cultural figure in London. Rahman. He's a cultural figure in London. He's very comfortable in London.
And yet he got famous because of in Spain in the West because of Slumdog Millionaire. That's an irony also, because only because they won the Oscars and that music song was discarded from within it. So it's a complex scenario.
No, I know it's a complex thing, but what I'm trying to say is that there is a huge difference between the 60s, when the Beatles came to India, and today, when I think the world is much closer, when technology has brought the world much closer. And you must understand that there's a huge leap, even in terms of the way musicians think today. They are no longer, and I mean, as Anushka said very, very well, in her session with you, that is changed what her father did and what she does, because her father was bringing Indian music, but she is tempted to also, to take as well. I mean, I think there's much deeper auspices. Already the two cultures have enmeshed and influenced each other. I don't think you can separate Western culture with Indian Eastern culture anymore, that much anymore, because both of them had influenced each other.
Perhaps, yes, please.
So I think that those old stereotypes, they may exist in people's minds. And such stereotypes, not just about India, but anywhere. I mean, there is a stereotype about Spain and Britain. There's a stereotype about Italy in Britain, and vice versa. So these stereotypes are always, the cultural stereotype will always be there. But in reality, I think people know each other much more. The magic of the Beatles, the magic of Ravi Shankar, the magic of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who also went out as a guru, as a young man to America, to sort of teach translation. The magic is that they built the bridge. They were pioneers. And that is the story I try to write, of this great, amazing across the universe, exercise. And I think that even when we sort of sit back and look at it and the impact of it, I think it's quite incredible. And the Beatles played a central role in
that. I think that's as a document itself, the research you've done, I wanted to praise you for that, because it's very well balanced. As I said, I think we should get the stories. I mean, there've been so many books on the Beatles, but just adds a new angle into that tapestry of fragments that we have about visions, angles on the Beatles. I think this was lacking. I mean, this kind of work was just not around before you. I mean, there was books and photographs by Paul Saltzman, who's there, and other journalists, snippets here and there. I think all of that research, fortunately, as far as I know, for audiences, larger audiences, will be available soon through a film, if I'm not mistaken, a documentary film, which will be perhaps the climax in your Beatles in India story, I hope. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I don't really much about the film, but it has been an exciting adventure. It has been a really exciting adventure for me to take this book to the next level and actually make a film, my first film. And we had this great team in London, and we, shot. We've done interviews across India, in London. We've got some really amazing, rare archival material. So it's been such an exciting adventure. It just shows that the Beatles story. And I would like to emphasize this because we are living in the time of pandemic. The world has been turned upside down. COVID has damaged this world a lot, and we shall need healing soon.
Yeah.
Once we come out of this, and I can't think any better way than the story of the Beatles. Because I think we look back sometimes to heal ourselves. And I do believe that the Beatles have their role, because the Beatles, and I'm just quite amazed at the interest in the Beatles, which still exists. I mean, anything about the Beatles always excites people. I mean, I was amazed at the kind of response I got at my launch parties of my book, which were across India. And the biggest one was in Bhutan, with me, Usha Uttup, the great Indian pop singer, and Nasiruddin Shah, the great Bollywood actor, all three of us on the stage singing John Lennon's Imagine, with the Queen Mother of Bhutan clapping and urging us on. I mean, what was an amazing launch party. I mean, so I'm telling you, the Beatles, there is something about the Beatles which is different from other rock bands, and I'm very fond of other rock bands as well. But they're because it is, and I asked an 18-year-old at the ashram when I went there, and I said, listen, and her mother said she dragged me here. I was going to the temple, but she dragged me here. She wanted the Beatles ashram. So I said, what do you get it? I mean, this is a group which is past century. How are you interested in the Beatles? So she looked and worried her thought to herself and said, they appeal to the heart.
Mm.
And there is something about the Beatles which connects, which touches you. And I think that I think is the story and the saga of the Beatles.
So can we somehow conclude, because we are shortly running out of time, and I like the way, or the journey of the session, how it's led to more emphasizing our inner healing, inner emotions, and how these things appeal to us, because history at large and historical incidents, and in particular musicians, artists, big geniuses. We've just celebrated 250 years of Beethoven. We're still celebrating 100 years of Ravi Shankar. We will soon celebrate Satyajit Ray's, the filmmaker, centenary. Also the 100 years of creation of Shantiniketan by Ravi Shankar. Would you be able? Could we maybe conclude by saying that the Beatles, they don't belong to a particular world. the paradigms we used in those days, the binary world of East and West, and West meeting East, East then meeting West, or vice versa. This dialogue, which was very much part of the way we thought in those days, and as you said, Anushka put it very, very nicely yesterday, we should stop thinking in binary terms. The Beatles belong to everyone. They don't belong to anyone and to everyone. They're part of Indian history. They're part of the history of Bhutan. They're part of everybody's history because it's a, of course, they come from somewhere. They come from Liverpool, yes. But once they're out of there, they become, it becomes universal. And for that matter, take any artist, we can't claim artists or musicians or great art. It belongs to.
I would make a brief final point. What is unique about the Beatles, and mind you, this bridge, or this East meets West, has been going on for centuries. A lot of people have come and they've tried to, but it's always limited to small numbers of people, small numbers of knowledgeable people. I think what the Beatles did, and what is unique about the Beatles, is because of their mass following. That's what happened to Ravi Shankar, because Ravi Shankar was well known in the West, but only to small circles, to people who knew about Indian classical music. What the Beatles had these huge audiences. And I think that's what the 60s meant, that it wasn't just a small group of people. It became a mass movement. So suddenly India was introduced not to a small group of people anymore, but to British society at large, to a British working class boy, because the Beatles were working class, for God's sake. And I think that is the uniqueness of the Beatles, that they spread, this whole message. And now what we take for granted, because today we live in a far less elitist world than in the 60s or earlier on, where I think people have, communicate with each other through the net and everything so easily. But I think the Beatles started it all.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end the session. Ajoy, you are not only a Beatles fan, not only a journalist. I asked you in the beginning if it was the journalist in you or the Beatles fan who made you, jump at this idea or the offer to do the book. I can tell that it's a holistic self in you, and the Beatles fan in you, might have helped you when you got difficult periods in writing a book. Writing a book is always a long process, and the journalist gave that kind of rigor and cultural analysis. So I think this is a very, very competent combination. We get to hear more of you and hear, listen, see, watch. We are very excited about the idea of hopefully being able not only to see the film, but maybe present it in Spain, hopefully in autumn, if things get better. And as you said, this is not an analogic world. It's not a binary world. It's a digital world. And if it's not possible in person, we can still do it online. And all these platforms now exist in any case. But the pleasure of having a book in your hands, this should not take away from us. You can do it on your Kindle, also on your laptop. But for those of you who have not been able to grab a copy, the magic of these platforms is also you can just order it online. It comes to your home and you can read this wonderful book, easy to read, also very poignant, and you learn a lot about India, and you learn a lot about music, cultural history, and it's fun to read. Ajoy, it's been a pleasure. I hope you can come to our center and visit our Casa de la India. Casa means house, that it's home, and most welcome to stay here to give talks, and who knows, maybe to present the film in the near future.
Yes, looking forward, Guillermo, looking forward. I'm looking forward to this. I'm glad that we did this today, but I certainly look forward to coming later this with my film. I'm really looking forward to meet Spanish people, because I know Spanish people are passionate, and so am I. because it's the passion which drives you ultimately for a book like this, for a film like this. So, we hope this relationship with Casa de la India deepens, and we can do many more programs virtually and in real life.
Thank you so much, and we'll definitely invite you for some of the roundtable discussions as a journalist and to analyze other subjects, contemporary subjects. So much that we would like you to have you here. We will soon connect through our platform. We have also the Spain-India Dialogue Forum. It's called Spain-India Encounters, Digital Encounters. See you soon. Namaste, namaskar. And after this, we have to watch, either a film by the Beatles or listen to some of these songs. So go home and put on your iPad or just watch documentary film about the Beatles. Enjoy the Beatles and all the best. Thank you, Ajoy. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Muchas gracias a todos.